Dave Ramsey has some crazy ideas about how you can spend 8% of your nest egg every year and make it through retirement. Someone recently called in to his radio show and was asking about the 4% rule, and he, quote, called them stupid, goobers, morons, called the 4% rule bogus, and he said it pisses him off to no end.
The problem is when you go down these stupid nerd rabbit holes in these Reddit threads with these morons who live in their mother's basement with a calculator, and then you put that out into the dadgum community, and then people go, I don't have enough money. It's hopeless. I'll never be able to save enough to retire. $1 million should create for you an $80,000 income, boys and girls. So you should, perpetually.
He says that not only should you be able to spend 4%, but you should be able to spend 8% in retirement, and explain that the market has averaged 12% a year, and then if you subtract the 4% inflation, then that equals 8%. But the market hasn't averaged 12% a year. The market averaged 12% from a period from like if you look on the Vanguard site, it'll show what it's averaged over time, and it shows that it's averaged 12% from the period from 1926 to 2021. But it doesn't show the sequence of returns, and it also doesn't show how it's done during bad periods. Why not take a look at it, how it's done from, say, the peak in 1929 to the bottom in 2009? I think that's closer to 7%. And they'll also show how it may have done during other periods. But again, we're not looking at peak to trough periods, and we're not looking at sequence of returns. So the study that was done about the 4% rule shows sequence of returns and shows that not every year is going to be a great year. Some years are going to be good years and some years are going to be bad years, but if you're pulling out every year, you're actually working the dollar cost averaging in reverse. So if you look at dollar cost averaging, there's an example we'll show right here where dollar cost averaging, if you plug in money all at once and the market goes up and down and gets back to where it was, you make a 0% return. But if it goes up and down, you're putting in every month and it gets back to where it was, you put in less when it's up, you put in more when it's down, it gets back, and you actually make a 4% return. But the problem is in retirement, that's going in reverse. Dollar cost averaging is going in reverse, and it works against you. So we're actually dealing with reverse dollar cost averaging when we're talking about this 4% rule, or Dave Ramsey's doubling of the 4% rule, the 8% rule, which when we run the analysis on this, it works only about 33% of the time in the best of times. So when we look at it, we're actually working this in reverse. The sequence of returns works against you. You're pulling out more when the market goes down as a percentage. You're pulling out less when it goes up, but you're actually, if you work that in reverse, you end up with a negative 4% return, whereas if you didn't pull out anything, it's just zero. So if you remember, during the pandemic, the government actually let us not have to take out distributions during the pandemic, because they knew that if people pulled out when it was down that much, then it would hurt their future. And so they gave us an option of not having to take out in 2020 for people who are already retired and were forced to take out by the government. So they said, well, we don't have to do it this year. And they did it this year because they wanted to give us a reprieve. They wanted to make it more likely that we're going to make it through retirement and things are going to work for us. So a lot of people said, okay, I'm not going to take my required distribution now. We might take a little bit extra down the road, but we're not going to do it now because it's going to hurt us worse. So even the government understood how this sequence of returns works and how reverse dollar cost averaging hurts. But Dave Ramsey doesn't seem to understand this. He's just saying, oh, well, it's averaged 12% since 1926 through 2021. And if inflation's 4%, then we'll just make up the difference. And that leaves no room for error. And there's always going to be these sequences of returns. It's not going to be 12% every year. Some years it might be better than that. It might be 15%, it might be 20%. Some years it's going to be down. If we're taking out when it's down, it kills the portfolio. And so we got to work on a different way of thinking about things to where it doesn't kill the portfolio. We've got some examples here, and something that we thought through over time. My mother grew up on a farm, and they had it actually as an apple orchard when she was younger, and they transitioned it into a farm later on. And they grew apples and kept a lot of apples in the barn. And so I've heard about her growing up on the apple orchard when she was little, and how my grandfather used to get good harvests and whatnot, and they'd keep some aside for rainy days just in case things got bad. And so if we think about retirement, we can think about having an apple orchard where we produce fruit, and the fruit is what we live on. And these trees are going to produce a lot of good fruit in some years. They're not going to produce as much fruit in other years. And those are the years where it's good to keep a lot of extra fruit in the barn for when it's not so good. And we also might want to have some younger saplings that are going to grow into good fruit producing trees for later on also. So we have some that are set aside for growth. We have some that's set aside for income. We have some set aside in the barn. And if we're working on the 4% rule, we're assuming that everything is always in the fruit producing side, and there's nothing in the barn. And that may not be the best way to look at things. So let's take a look at some examples of reverse dollar cost averaging against, say, a retirement income harvesting strategy. This first example shows starting in March of 2000. Now, what happened in March of 2000? We had the height of the dot-com boom. Some of you remember the dot-com boom. We remember in 1999 where everybody was afraid that the world was going to end because all the clocks were going to revert, and they were going to go to 2000, and we didn't have enough zeros, and because we didn't have enough zeros or room for the zeros, everything was going to end, and so we had to reprogram everything. And I remember watching in the start of the new year, starting in Australia, how Australia didn't blow up, and Russia didn't blow up, and Europe didn't blow up, and we got to the U.S., and guess what? Nothing happened. But all this infrastructure was spent on protecting from the Y2K debacle, and all this money was spent on infrastructure for dot-com companies, and the internet was booming right then. But after all that money was spent, we got to March, and the market topped, and we went through quite a few years of downturns. And so we went through 2001 and 2002, part of 2003 wasn't so good. And so what we can see here is what happened if we took out 4% a year. So the blue is the market, and you can see the market went down the most, and it also came back up the most. The orange there is reverse dollar cost averaging. So it went down not quite as much as the blue, but it didn't recover near as well. So between the blue and the orange there, you're actually losing 1.77% a year from the time from March of 2000 through June of 2007, when the market got back up to where it started. So it took a while to get back up to where it started, but it did. It got back up to where it started if you're looking at the S&P. But if we'd set aside some money, say we set aside a few $100,000 out of a couple million to live off of during the times where it's not so plenty, we actually don't lose as much. We don't make back up as much, but we get back to where we started at the same time that the market does. And so it doesn't hurt us in the interim. And we don't lose that 1.77% a year. So this is a good way to help protect from the 4% rule, which isn't as good as reverse dollar cost averaging, and sure isn't as good as Dave Ramsey's crazy 8% rule, which is very unlikely to work. This other example shows the peak in 2007, and you can see here that in the blue, that's the S&P 500 itself. It got back up to where it was in October of 2007 and March of 2013, so it took about 6 years to get back. And if we were taking 4% out a year, we lost 1.95% a year. So it doesn't work as well as even the 2000 example. And in this case, if we set aside a few $100,000 out of this couple million, then it wouldn't have gone down as much, and we end up in the same place as the S&P 500 in March of 2013. So we're showing how setting aside some money and keeping it safe makes a lot of sense. Now, when does it make sense? There are times when it doesn't make sense. When it makes sense is when we're starting with high enough interest rates that we're making money on what we have set aside. And these examples are showing a 4% interest rate. Now, we understand that interest rates are higher now. We can get between 5.5% and 6% investing in treasury bonds and things of that nature, and CDs and maybe fixed annuities, what have you. But even at 4%, this works really well. When it doesn't work as well is when we're starting with a low interest rate and when the market's up the entire time. So we take a look at 2013, and in this example, interest rates weren't quite as good, and the market was up the entire time. So we look at this from 2013 through July of 2020, we end up with extremely low interest rates, and the reverse dollar cost averaging strategy doesn't do as well. It doesn't do as well as just holding on to the market. It's a loss of about 2.5% a year, but it does about the same as the income harvesting strategy. So what we want to do, especially when interest rates are starting out at a good high rate, like where they are right now, over 5%, we can set some aside, and that'll be our dry powder for the future if it goes down enough. But it'll also be something that we can live on in case things get really bad, and so that it doesn't affect the rest of our portfolio. We don't have to sell out of good things when they're down. So as Howard Marks has said, and we've repeated this over and over again, the best time to be buying when someone's forced to be selling, and people who are in retirement may be forced to be selling if they're undergoing this reverse dollar cost averaging strategy and all they own are stocks. If they are going through something called like a retirement income harvesting strategy and they have some dry powder on the side, say in treasuries or CDs or what have you, that they can spend over time and not have to touch their stock portfolio, that can work out a whole lot better. So those are the things we want to think through. We want to make sure we set aside plenty for a rainy day. We want to have that money set aside to provide income for us. We want to have some money set aside to provide growth for the future as well. To the extent that you have these will differ based upon your risk tolerance and how you want to be going forward. But if you want to be as safe as possible, I would incur a retirement income harvesting strategy. And don't listen to Dave Ramsey in this case, because this 8% rule thing that he's got going on is just crazy. Even in the best of times, it only works about a third of the time. And I don't think a third of the time is high enough for you to base your financial future on. So that's all we have for today. Thank you for tuning in. Please put those thumbs up for us and like the channel and subscribe so you can get stuff in the future. And as always, stay thirsty for knowledge.